happy to be in conversation with Andrew Kasoy, who's been is joining us from New York this evening. Andrew is a co-founder and CEO of B Lab, the nonprofit behind the BCorp movement. He's also an Aspen Fellow, and as we discovered in preparing for this event, Andrew and I both grew up in the same town in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado. So it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us.
Todd, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here with you.
We thought we'd launch off by talking a little bit about your career. You've dedicated your career to finding for-profit and non-profit solutions and models for social change. How did that interest come about? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, it's maybe too long a story to go through the whole thing, but I, as you said, grew up in Boulder, Colorado, in an environment that was very much focused on social justice. And so when I was growing up, I always thought that I would do something related to that, like something that was related to public service. I worked for some different policymakers when I was a youth, like in high school. But when I got out of college, I actually ended up going off to work in the private sector, and I worked on Wall Street in the private equity industry. So I became an investor, and originally I did that because the politician who had been a mentor, who I wanted to go to Washington, D.C. and work for after college, told me that I needed to go off and have some experience in the real world, that if I wanted to come and try to help solve people's problems using public policy, that I ought to actually understand what those problems were like and how the economy worked. And so I went off and started a job that led to a 16-year career in the private equity industry, where I largely just put my head down and didn't really pay too much attention to many of the ideas that or values that I had been raised with. And it was really in 2001 when I became a Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute, actually. That was the first time since I had graduated from college that I actually lifted my head up and started to think about how my values connected to the work that I was doing and to the things that I actually wanted to see happen in the world. And that
can I interrupt you just briefly at that point? And I'm curious because as you were describing your trajectory, you said you were keeping your head down. What was it that, I mean, I didn't hear you say that you lost your values necessarily, but that you didn't pay as much attention to them. What got in the way?
I think this is something that's maybe not as true today. When I went into the work world in Washington, in Wall Street, you sort of like, you put on a uniform to go to work. You put on your game face. And values and work were separated. You were expected to focus on the work that you were doing, which in that case was about making money through investing, and your values were something that you were to follow after work, maybe by doing some service work or working at a homeless shelter or giving money away through philanthropy after you had accumulated it. Like that was the model, I think, that that many people in that time thought of as the way to do good in the world. The connection between the place that you actually spent the most of your time and the impact that you had on the world, which was through your work, and your values, was somehow missing. And so they were very much separated. And around the time that I became an Aspen Fellow, I had the opportunity, by being part of that fellowship, to really like look in a mirror, or to have the other fellows that I was there with and the dialogue that we were engaged in sort of hold up a mirror and force me to ask myself some of those questions, like why is business just business, and then values are for after work? And that began a process of not so much rejecting the idea of business or investing, but recognizing that values and purpose needed to be built into them, not separate from them.
And you talked a little bit about the way in which others around you became mirrors. Who are the other mirrors that you've had as you've pursued this career from finance into what's become the B Corp movement?
Well, first of all, I've been really lucky over the course of my life to have a lot of great mentors, and I don't think we say enough about mentors and the impact that they have on us, the examples that they set for us. And so I was lucky enough, for example, when the reason I got an Aspen Fellowship was that this congressman, actually, who I mentioned earlier, who had told me in the first place that I should go try to do something out in the real world, just asked me really simply one day over a cup of coffee when I was back in Boulder, Colorado, seeing him. He said, so I'm just curious, when are you going to come back to that service life that you mentioned that you used to be really committed to? And it was a pretty simple question, but that was a mirror held up and a forcing question. The thing that's made me the most lucky, if we jump ahead to the creation of the B Corp movement, and I'm happy to talk about how that actually happened.
Please do.
It really started with two of my best friends from college who'd also gone off and done different things in the private sector, and were similarly at a point of questioning the way in which business is done, and how they might have more of an impact. In the words of the Aspen Fellowship, how to go from success to significance in the next phase of their life. And I don't really think of myself as an entrepreneur. And so I was lucky to have a couple of really close friends, essentially, again, hold up a mirror for me and allow me to hold up a mirror for them, so that we could sort of in fellowship make this leap together to starting this organization, B Lab. And I wish I could say it was like an epiphany that I had while sitting there in an Aspen seminar room, but it was more of like a dawning realization that took a few years to gain the courage to make a real switch. And so while I started the Crown program in 2001, it wasn't until 2006, actually 5 years later, that I finally left the private equity industry, and that we began to form the nonprofit organization that became B Lab.
So five years of searching for courage. Say a little bit more about that, and then I'd love to hear about B Lab.
It sounds a little bit pathetic, doesn't it? That it
No,
5 years to find courage, but I think I think many of you will know when you're good at something and it becomes part of your identity, it's sort of hard to imagine life in a different way. And so while the work that I was doing was in some ways disconnected from my values, it was in other ways quite meaningful because I was good at it, and it was part of my identity. And so it just took, I think it took a few years of realizing first that it was time to be doing something different, and then to try to figure out what that actually was, where could I actually do something that would feel really useful. And also somewhere in there, I had a couple of children, and that sort of slowed me down as well. But really, the biggest realization during that period of time was that somebody asked me to join the board of an organization called Echoing Green, which is a not-for-profit based in the United States that funds social entrepreneurs, mostly nonprofit entrepreneurs who are starting organizations to try to change some system that is broken or solve some social or environmental problem. And as I joined the board of this organization, I started to meet with many of the fellows, many of these social entrepreneurs, who were starting to have the realization that they could use business to scale solutions to social or environmental problems, sometimes faster than they would be able to do it through a nonprofit or an NGO model. And as I started to spend time with some of these social entrepreneurs, trying to help them think about their business model or how they might raise capital, I realized two things. The first one was that the market wasn't built for these kinds of entrepreneurs. The market was built to invest in businesses that were trying to maximize financial value as quickly as possible. But these entrepreneurs were trying to create businesses that maximized impact as fast as possible. And somehow that equation couldn't compute for most investors. Investors would talk to these entrepreneurs and say, oh, but if you just change this, you can get more margin. Or if you stop selling this product to these vulnerable populations and instead sell it to wealthy people for more, then you can get a greater profit margin and you'll make more money for the business. And the entrepreneur would say, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it in order to serve this vulnerable population. So there was this mismatch in understanding because the capital markets had been built for a certain purpose. The second realization I had, which was more personal, was that I was having a lot more fun every day talking and trying to help these social entrepreneurs than I was doing my day job. And when I realized that I was spending half of my time sitting in my office each day working with these people instead of doing the job that I was being paid for, that was finally a pretty good indication that it was really time to make a switch.
So both a reconnection to things that were part of your value system, but also as you thought about the market, the idea that there would be different ways of calculating value. So say a little bit more about B Lab and the B Corp movement.
Well, when we started around that time in 2006, the basic idea was we ought to be able to build the kind of market infrastructure that it would allow these kinds of entrepreneurs that wanted to use business as a force for good, business to solve social and environmental problems, that would allow them to more easily be recognized and to succeed in the market. And when we started, the main tool that we came up with to do that was to create a certification, a little bit like fair trade for coffee or organic for milk, but B Corp certification. The idea was to certify the whole business, was to measure and know that a business was good on the whole for society and the environment. And as we were creating the certification, we realized there were like two things that it needed to address. One was that there were no standards at the time in order to help someone differentiate between a good business and just good marketing. There were endless numbers of ads for companies with windmills and solar panels and African farmers holding fertile earth. But no set of measures, no judgment of whether the whole company was actually good for society. The second thing was that the rules of business, like the actual legal rules of business in most markets, and at the time we were mostly focused on the US, but we discovered this was true in most places around the world, the legal rules for corporations required companies to maximize value for their shareholders and actually made directors liable if they were making trade-offs in favor of social or environmental issues. And so the second thing that we wanted to address through the certification, the first was standards. What were the standards that would actually help somebody measure the social and environmental impact of a business, the performance from an impact perspective? The second thing was about fiduciary duty and actually getting businesses to change their underlying fiduciary duties so that they would make themselves accountable, legally accountable, to consider the interests of their stakeholders when they made decisions. So those were the two main components of the B Corp certification. And when we started, we basically went to the businesses that we were already aware of and sort of begged them to become certified because there was no value to a B Corp certification. It didn't mean anything. And so we, at the beginning, had to really go and find the entrepreneurs who were most likely to say, I want to lead by contributing to something bigger than just my own business. And so the first 80 certified B Corps in 2007 were the kinds of businesses that just said, we're in, without knowing what they were in for. And that was the beginning of the B Corp movement. And today, 15 years later, there are, in that first year, there were 80 B Corps, and they were all in the US, and they were all small, privately held companies. Today, there are about 3,800 certified B corporations. They're in 74 countries around the world. They're in 150 different industries. They range from small place-based sole proprietorships to large multinationals that trade on public stock exchanges.
So you're not begging them anymore.
Some, but more and more they come to us. Although the bar for certification, this is not like a membership club, and we've made it hard. And over time, we've made it harder as we've learned more. And so it's still a challenging process to help companies get through.
And do you find this changing the way people think about the market as such? And has it had a response on the part of both investors and shareholders?
Yeah, it has. I mean, I think that this has been an evolving work over time. And I certainly wouldn't want to take credit, just our organization, for the evolution in the way maybe many people are thinking about business or the capital markets, or what people would sort of call reimagining capitalism. But I think we've contributed to that debate, and the way we've done it is really to create this credible community of leaders. What people look at when they see those 3,800 certified B corporations are not individual heroes, but a community of businesses, all of whom have met the same set of standards for impact. And they lead collectively and inspire others to follow. And I think the example that they've set, and then the narrative that we've been able to create about the purpose of business, has been really powerful for the businesses that follow. And the best way that I can know that at least that's beginning to work is that while there are 3,800 certified B corporations, there are about 130,000 companies that use the same impact measurement and management tool, the B impact assessment, that certified B corporations use. There are about over 130,000 companies that use it as a tool to measure and manage their impact. So there's huge leverage from the example that's set by those by that small group of companies that have met that high bar.
So a lot of leaders and people and companies leading by example. 3,800 mirrors being held up. As you've worked with them, or as you've observed, or even in your own experience, has your understanding or their understanding of leadership changed as they've made these transitions within their organizations and with their boards and investors and so forth?
Yeah, I think dramatically. I think the model for leadership in both business and in the social space too, for a long time, has been about the heroic individual. Even like in the field of social entrepreneurship, we often, we celebrate the individuals. And one of the things that I think has been extraordinary in watching this community of leaders is the way in which they see themselves as doing this work collectively as a community of practice. That they have enough humility to recognize that like individual heroes might be able to make a lot of change through their own business, but that they can't change a system. A system changes when people gather together in community, and that community in motion becomes a movement. And that movement has the capacity to change the rules of the game. And so what's been most amazing to me about most of the leaders in the B Corp movement is their ability to it's not so much that they don't have egos, but that they are able to control them or channel them in a way that they're able to act collectively. And that collective action by these businesses is very powerful because businesses employ a lot of people, and so they can have an impact collectively together on all of the people that they employ, on the people who are their customers. Because they employ people and create economic growth in their communities, they can have a lot of impact collectively on policymakers to change the rules of the game. And when they're willing to work collectively, they can also influence investors. And there's one thing that I learned from being an investor, which is that investors at some level are like investors often are the least courageous actors in the economic ecosystem, because there's not much for them to measure themselves by other than their financial performance. A business can measure itself in lots of other ways if it really wants to, if it tries. It's harder for investors to do that. And so I think these businesses speaking together have been able to begin to influence the capital markets. And that's what's allowed, just in the last 2 years, more and more public companies to join the B Corp movement, that investors have started to get the message and realize that these kinds of businesses are better for the long term, better for their shareholders, and better for society.
Well, it's interesting going back even to your own story, right? You were interested in politics because as a vehicle for change. There's also a sense that the nonprofit sector is a vehicle for change. But what's striking to me in your description is that, in fact, it may be these socially conscious businesses that occupy a space that can be more effective, both in short-term and long-term change. Is that an accurate threading of the needle, as it were?
Yeah, the only thing I would be careful about is saying more effective. Like, I think one of the things that I'm pretty careful about is recognizing that nonprofits and government play absolutely necessary but insufficient role in driving change. And the private sector makes up a massive percentage of GDP in most places. In the US, it's probably 80% of the economy. And so if we can't figure out how to change the rules of the game, change the system of business, then we won't address the big problems that we face. So it's not so much that I think that they are more effective, but that they are a necessary actor, and in certain situations can be more effective. But I also think there are plenty of places where there are plenty of voids where business is just not the solution to the problem, and where we absolutely need NGOs and we absolutely need a strong government. And I think sometimes we risk, this is another sort of part of like the business person as hero. I think we risk actually diminishing the role that government or NGOs can play when we sort of heroize these businesses too much. So I think it's all about like the ecosystem and all of these different players acting together that really is the most powerful way for us to address the big problems we face.
I want to come back to impact in a second, but I'm really curious, without mentioning any names, have you spoken with this congressman, if this person's still alive, after the B Corp movement? What was the response?
Well, I'm really lucky. I talk to him all the time. He may have actually been your congressman too. I
was wondering.
Yeah, no, his name is David Skaggs. Yeah, he was a congressman from Colorado. He's still alive and very, very active. In fact, he's very involved in congressional ethics, and yes, I talk to him quite frequently, and he's been like a great advisor throughout this process as we've grown this movement, and he's encouraged me greatly, and he's also kept me connected to that role of government, I would say. Entrepreneurs, as many of you in the audience will know, can often be pretty dismissive of government. It's too slow. it's too bureaucratic. When you're an entrepreneur, you just want to like move, break glass, solve problems. And I think people often think that government doesn't play that, can't do that. And I think one of the things that we have realized over time is that there's such an important role for government in this process.
Let's come back to impact for a second. You talked about developing the standards and the difficulties of doing so. How have you continued to refine the ways in which you try to measure things that the market hasn't traditionally measured?
Yeah. Well, when we started, like good entrepreneurs, we created an impact assessment on a Excel spreadsheet over the course of a weekend that asked some questions about a business's practices with its workers, the communities in which it did business, the environment, its consumers. And we took it to some business leaders and asked them to go through it. And pretty quickly we realized that we were entirely wrong. We were asking all the wrong questions, but it began a process. And so the most important thing we learned was that it is all about creating a good set of standards. It's all about having a great process. And so the B impact assessment is versioned. Every 3 years, a new version of it comes out, and it uses the data and the best practices from the field that we've learned about the ways in which business has an impact on society and the environment to refine those standards. And the second thing about that process that's important is that it's independent. So while we have created a certification, and what our nonprofit is provides that certification to companies, there's an independent standards advisory council that's made up of people who have expertise in different impact areas, who are the ones who create the questions in the impact assessment and the weightings, and then iterate over time with each of these versions.
And and you mentioned earlier that that this started in the United States, but it spread to over 70 countries.
Right.
Is it becoming embedded in global companies, or is this something that only in large measure more developed or wealthy countries can afford?
We have different versions of the impact assessment for different markets in order to recognize that the things that have the most impact in an industrialized market are different than what's important in an emerging market. And similarly, there are different questions for different industries and different weightings. So,
and are there cultural differences as well, where the measures of impact might have to be refined?
There are, and we're actually, as we've become much more global, one of the things that our standards team is in the midst of doing is more localization of those standards, recognizing cultural context. Is very important. So, we have the humility, I suppose, to know that it's always got to be better. That what we're doing is always, when we look back, we'll always say, "Oh, what we were doing then was wrong," and needs to evolve. And that's one of the ways in which it has to evolve, is that kind of like localization or local context. At the same time, it's really important to have a global set of standards so that there's some form of comparability, and that it means the same thing to be a certified B Corp here as it does in Uganda.
I'll pause here for a second and just say that we've got about a half an hour left as part of our fireside chat with Andrew. And we wanted to get things started, just the two of us. But everybody on Remo will see on the right-hand side, there's a chat function. And if you go to the question and answer button, the Q&A, you can go ahead and start putting questions in the Q&A, and we'll weave them into the conversation. But let's pick up where we left off, Andrew. We've talked a little bit about new leadership and the importance of adaptation. And one of the other themes for this summit is globalization, which we were talking about. Globalization means different things to different people. I mean, how do you think about globalization and its advantages, its disadvantages, or challenges? I know there's a lot there, so take it in whatever order that you'd like.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen over the last several years is that just having globalization, that some people, I guess, think about globalization as just being about like unfettered free markets. And I don't think that that works particularly well. It leads to like an incredible level of resource extraction and exploitation by the powerful over from the vulnerable. And I think it leads to, because there's so much is done in sort of like a faceless way, little sense of responsibility for the stakeholders of a business. They're too far away. Often they don't even work for the company. They work for a supplier of a supplier of a supplier. And so, so companies barely know who their customers are, or who their workers are, or who's providing the raw resources that go into their products. And so while I think there are many benefits of globalization, I'm not in any way opposed to globalization. I think that a set of norms for how globalization works, how we benefit from it, at the same time that we exercise care, I guess, is really important. And so I like, when I think about that in the context of our own work, we think a lot in our standards, for example, about supply chains, because it's one thing to assess a business sitting in the United States and how it treats its own workers who actually work directly for it. But in a globalized economy, we've got to look at how that company engages with other companies down through its supply chain to actually think about, for example, in the case of a coffee company in the US, the farmers and the coffee co-ops in Colombia that are its ultimate suppliers. And all too often that just isn't a factor. No one's paying attention. And the carelessness that comes from that, I think, is what leads to inequality and climate change and lots of the other things that we see that are the negative externalities that can be caused by business.
And that picks up a couple of the questions that have come up in the chat already. As we think about the post-pandemic world, racial justice and climate change are central concerns, and how we think about stakeholder governance in that. But then also to the example that you were just giving, what are some of the other obstacles that businesses encounter as they think about embracing the B Corp movement?
Well, there are a lot of obstacles to trying to practice business in a totally different way than the rules have been set up for them to practice it. Particularly for large companies that have got third-party capital, either from private equity or venture investors, or if they're in the public markets, from public institutions, there's a total misalignment. Even if the business itself wants to consider its stakeholders, the rules of corporate law, as I said at the beginning, in most cases say that they can't, or if they can, it has to be cloaked in profit maximization. We can do something good for the environment by changing the light bulbs because we save 2 cents per light bulb in energy usage. But they've got to put it in those terms. It can't ever be put in terms of a trade-off, but that's actually good for those stakeholders, and potentially therefore good over the long term for the business, but good for those stakeholders. Not only is that a problem, the rules for investors also have the same problem. Like investors have a set of fiduciary rules themselves that say that they need to maximize the value of the investments that they make. And so I think one of the biggest obstacles for companies to become certified B corporations, particularly public companies, is that they have to make this change in their corporate articles. They have to be what we call a benefit corporation. They have to have stakeholder governance built into their business. And for many companies, until the last 12 or 18 months, for the first 14 years that we were doing this, that was a huge impediment, that companies were worried that if they ever asked their investors to change their corporate form, that they would be branded as soft, or at best, and at worst, that they would be branded as being in violation of their fiduciary duties.
Well, and that brings up one of the other questions in the chat. Have you found instances where companies have gotten the B Corp label, but then turned out not to be meeting the standards?
Yeah. So it's important to say, like, the way we do the certification is that when companies submit for certification after they've gone through this impact assessment, we do verification work. So it's a little bit like an auditor looking at a company's financial statements. And so we do verification work. And so frequently companies don't make it through that process. But occasionally a company will get certified. And when they go to recertify later, 3 years later, because they have to recertify every 3 years so that they maintain their standards, occasionally a company will have fallen below the bar because they will have stopped using some of the good practices they had before, and we will have to decertify them.
Is there a decertification, or is there probation, or they wait for the other 3-year cycle?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're not an activist, so we're not out there like looking to sort of gotcha, to like to throw people out. And so we will try to give people some time and some resources to help them get back above the bar. But ultimately, if a company can't get above the bar, then they will have to be decertified. And so, yeah, we decertify companies. And when we do that, again, we're not there to try to make an embarrassment of them and shame them. But they lose their certification.
Right. They want a standard of excellence, and you're there to help them achieve the standard of excellence.
One of the most powerful things about the movement to me is that, and this gets back to this sense of community and businesses working together, is that, and it's also something about the way in which entrepreneurs are pretty competitive people by nature, is that we have very little churn in the B Corp community. Very small percentage of businesses that leave the community. And once they're in, they work hard actually to keep raising their own bar. So companies pretty intentionally try to improve. And we try to make sure that they have the resources to do that, but that they feel the challenge. And again, to that mirroring idea that we were talking about earlier, that they see their peers around them also striving to keep raising the bar. And that's a really powerful, that has a very powerful effect on these businesses. And, you know, I think like COVID has been a really interesting moment the last year to watch the effect that this has. A year ago today, I would have told you, we were sitting in meetings, pulling what little hair I have left in my head out, or maybe that's where it all went, because we were sure that in the midst of COVID, that these businesses, first of all, many B Corps would go out of business. And secondly, that the ones that didn't go out of business would think this was like the last thing that they could afford to be a part of at a moment when they needed to fight to survive. And third, that we would that the pipeline of new companies wanting to join the B Corp community would stop amidst all of the other chaos of the last year. And much to our surprise, it was the opposite of that. I think companies realize that COVID proved that we don't have the resilient economy that we might have thought we had, and that the B Corp movement provides an answer. And so we lost fewer B Corps in 2020 than we lost in 2018 or 2019. Wow. Companies, instead of making it the first thing that they let go of, made it the last thing. And almost the only companies that we lost were the few that went out of business.
And I know from talking with other executives that the resilience of employees, the sense of purpose, the attachment, the ability to work harder in these difficult circumstances was really key during the pandemic, where everything was new and people, I mean, we all became entrepreneurs in a way. Does that sense of connectedness to purpose play out in what you've just described?
I think that connection to purpose, that's true of the employees, but it's also true of the companies that in the community, the stories about the ways in which they stepped up for their people, and therefore their people probably felt loyal, are extraordinary. And a number of studies have been done about companies, for example, that signed the Business Roundtable's letter about stakeholder business, about the ways in which they didn't live up to the words on the piece of paper. And the B Corp community lived up to those accountabilities that they had created for themselves, and they looked to the community to help them. And so there are also just some these companies, like, they acted collectively to try to look out for each other, to try to do business with each other. When we had in the US racial justice uprisings after George Floyd was murdered in late May of last year, we had so many companies in the B Corp community start working together on solutions to racial justice problems inside their businesses and in the communities where they did business. So I think that that power of community, those relationships, really bound them together and held the community together through what's been like literally a hell of a year.
Yeah. Well, and sort of building on that, there are a number of questions in the chat about Hong Kong in particular as a socially conscious place. Any advice on how those founders, I think as it was put, or entrepreneurs in Hong Kong would take first steps toward B Corp certification?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. There are a number of B Corps in Hong Kong. In fact, we have an office in Hong Kong. We have B Lab Hong Kong, and we can distribute after this a link to their website and their contacts. But there's a team there, and they're building a community of B Corps in Hong Kong, and so would love to engage with any of the business leaders who are in the room in joining that community.
And back to the pandemic, you mentioned that the B Corps were extraordinarily resilient comparatively in 2020. Are you seeing an uptick of interest in 2021 as economies come back into fuller strength?
Yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, we have 3,800 certified B corporations. In the last 12 months, 2,500 new companies have submitted for certification.
Wow.
Yeah, so we have the biggest problem we have right now is a huge backlog of companies trying to get through that process, and so we're one of the great challenges for us, actually, in a difficult time in a nonprofit that relies in part on philanthropic support, has been that we've had to scale the size of the organization. We'll grow this year by about 50%. the number of people who work here in order to speed up that process of certification for the backlog of companies. And
so without putting you on the spot, then how are you all dealing with that scaling up as a way of maintaining corporate culture,
our own culture,
and the problems that come with scale?
Yeah, it is really hard. And it's particularly hard to grow like this at a time where we can't be together. Our organization has kind of grown up like a family over the last 14 or 15 years. Maybe like lots of other nonprofits, like we started with lots of young people, lots of young single people. Lots of those people are now 30 something and have families. And so we've literally gotten to like watch all of these families flourish inside of our bigger family. And we've always valued doing a lot of things together, like being together in person, putting resources into bringing people from all over the world together to be in community. And one of the biggest challenges of the last year has been growing an organization by 50% when none of those people have actually ever met each other is really hard. And the culture, I don't know that, I don't think we've lost the culture, but it certainly has suffered. And I think we have a lot of work to do. Like we're learning new ways of doing that. One of the most important parts of that has been what we call an ownership culture, but trying to empower people to really feel like they can make more decisions and take risks for themselves, because it's harder to do things when you can't bring people together.
And forgetting about scale for a moment, both in your experience and in what you've observed in others, how did the pandemic change, I'll just call it, people's theory and practice of leadership? I've heard people that I've talked to say, people that they didn't think were leaders at all rose to the occasion. Those who were really good in circumstances of stability turned out to be absolutely horrible in a context of confusion and uncertainty.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've always had this kind of like set of principles or values for our organization. And I forget if it's number 2 or number 3 on the list, has always been embrace uncertainty. And so we've mostly hired people who, we're an organization that's trying to, the way I like to put it is like, our job is to be out where the buses don't run yet. We're supposed to be out ahead of the market. And that means inherently that there's always kind of like confusion and dead ends and mistakes. And so we've always tried to add people to the organization who seem like they could be resilient in the face of that kind of uncertainty or chaos. And I think that probably served us well through COVID. We didn't have too many people who were just kind of like frozen by it. But at the same time, it's been enormously hard on people emotionally. And one thing I would say that as a leader, that's been really hard for me to recognize is that that impact has been very different on different groups of people. And not just COVID, but other things that were happening, like in the US, between like some of us experience a racial justice uprising in the US as a moral issue, as a policy issue. Other people on our team were experiencing it like literally physically every day, as a physical threat, and their experience and therefore their ability to do the work that might be expected of them every day was different. And learning to recognize that and see that when you couldn't be physically together with people was a hugely humbling experience for me anyway, as a leader.
And it brings me back to Mr. Lung's remarks at the very beginning of this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. He spoke of needing more compassionate leaders, more adaptive leaders, people who are empowered to bring their best selves, but that meant, in his words, vulnerability. And it's interesting to hear you echo many of those same values or qualities. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get on to some questions of personal elevation. But there's a lot of interest in the chat about what you think could be done or done better to convert the unconverted, as it's called, and get more businesses on board to become B Corp members, particularly in Hong Kong.
So, I don't know your market as well as I'd like to. And so it's hard for me to talk about a specific market. But I think it's important to understand the context of the way business is practiced in a particular market. Like, there are places where our narrative or our message in the world of like large multinationals is quite different than, for example, family-owned businesses, where I think a lot of family-owned businesses in many markets sort of already think about themselves like this because they may be multi-generational businesses, and so they think about themselves as being there for the long term, but sometimes also have blind spots about the way in which they have impact on different stakeholders of their business. And so I think like one of the things that we've tried to do is by having independent B-Lab organizations in different markets is to allow them to take that narrative about economic systems change and about using business as a force for good, and turn it to be right in the context of their own market. But I think, like, when I think about what are the big things that need to happen if we wanted to convert the unconverted, I think there are really three key elements to systems change. Like any system that needs to change, we have to address three things, and we have to address them at the same time. One is we have to change people's behavior. Like, at the end of the day, businesses have to behave differently in the way they think about and treat all of their stakeholders. The second thing is that we have to change the culture of business. Like, if we want business's behavior to change, then we need to change the culture, like the norms, the expectations about what the purpose of business is, what's the role of business in society. And so that is a lot about narrative. If the first one, behavior change, is about standards and tools that actually enable business to behave in a different way, the second thing is about narrative. What's that broader message about the purpose of business? And conversations like this and a fellowship like this that allows you to, all of you, to work together in changing that narrative about the purpose of business in your communities, I think is critical. And then the third thing is that we have to change the rules of the game. That involves public policy, I think. Like, there are some things about the way in which business is practiced that are built into the law, that are built into investors' fiduciary duties and corporate directors' fiduciary duties and tax incentives, and many, many things like that, antitrust, that we have to address through public policy, so that business is playing by a set of rules that facilitates and makes meaningful and lasting that change in the narrative. So we can't do.
What about financial institutions? Do you see any movement there?
So I'm, as you might imagine, given where I came from, I am more cynical probably about big financial institutions than just about anything else. And I think that they have to be pushed. They're not likely to lead. And we've seen some evidence of some financial institutions at least talking a lot about important issues, like particularly climate change. But often there's a huge disconnect between what their leaders say and what their portfolio managers do with their investing. And so, yes, I think the cultural narrative work is important. Aspen has a fellowship, in fact, that particularly works with leaders in the finance world to help them try to create change from within. And I think that that's very important. But I also think that the rules that govern big financial institutions, because they are so powerful, need really a careful look. And that also requires global cooperation, because global financial institutions are so global in their behavior.
Well, if we go back to your discussion of behavior, the cultural narrative, and then also the rules, the legal system, that would sort of reinforce what you said a few moments ago, that gatherings like this are really important, because if there's going to be any kind of localization effort, it sounds like it's really going to be from the bottom up, not from the top down. And so all of you, as you begin to think about the ways in which more socially conscious business might flourish, it depends a lot on your own expertise and cultural facility in your own role in converting the unconverted, as it were. I'd like to take you back. Well, actually, before we go back to Aspen in August of 2001, are there other standards or competitors in the neutral sense, I guess, as you think about creating different systems, different narratives to have more socially conscious business?
There are many other organizations that are working in this space that are doing really important work. And one of the most important elements of systems change, or recognitions, I think, about systems change, is that no one organization is going to change the entire economic system by itself. So as much as I have a lot of hubris about what we're doing to build the BCorp movement, I recognize we're not going to do it by ourselves. And so I think collaboration amongst these organizations is critical. And so, no, there's not like a competitor to BCorp certification specifically, but there are many other ways of measuring social and environmental impact. There are many other systems of standards for reporting. There are many other organizations working on the narrative about economic systems change or reimagining capitalism. Aspen has the Business and Society program run by Judy Samuelson that does some amazing work in this sphere. And so I think collaboration between these organizations is really important if we actually want to make a difference. We helped launch an organization last year called Imperative 21 that's meant to be a platform for collaboration, that the imperative of the 21st century business is economic systems change. And they've launched a narrative campaign called Reset that launched last September, that many organizations that are doing similar work to ours are participating in. And so that element of like the culture shift in particular, I think requires many people to start to have a similar narrative. And then I also think any kind of policy change is going to require many organizations coming together to push policymakers to change. So back to the local context, young business leaders working together have a lot of power.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning my colleague, Judy Samuelson, who's just published a book actually on socially responsible business. I'll pass things back to Allison in just a second, but I'd like to take you back to Aspen in August of 2001, because you said that you were going through the executive leadership seminar and really wrestling with some questions about what you wanted to do, how you wanted to be a more purposeful leader. And I'll just ask you to reflect briefly, since we only have a couple of minutes left. What were the 2 or 3 things that really stood out to you as you went through that leadership journey?
Well, when I went through that program, it was late August. I believe it was like the last week of August of 2000. and I was living in downtown Manhattan at the time, and so I finished that first week, which was the first time since I had graduated from college where I had a real week away from thinking about work, to lift up my head and think about some of the important issues of our time. And then I went home, and a week later, we had 9/11.
And I'm sorry, Andrew. I'm gonna have to stop you there. It's entirely my fault, because of the miracles of remote technology. We have a hard stop in 56 seconds. But what I'm going to take away, taking words out of your mouth, is the opportunity to step back and really reflect. Allows you to step back into the arena when things go horribly wrong. Thank you, Andrew, and I'm sorry to cut us short here. Let me pass things back to Allison for a few closing remarks.
Thanks very much for having me.